Okay, so please have a seat. Let's move on to the second part of our symposium today. We have great speeches from great distinguished visitors from abroad and from Israel. Before we move on to the scientific part, I would like to say a sentence on a personal level. Is it? Okay, please be seated. I had the opportunity to work closely and to know Fani very well since I joined the epilepsy unit at 2013. And besides being a close friend and colleague, she was a great teacher, taught me a lot, and I'm always grateful, and and her memories will always stay in my heart. So our first speaker is Gabriel Kreiman. He's a professor at the Departments of Neurology and Ophthalmology, as well as Boston Children's Hospital. He's a member of the Center of Brain Science, Swartz Center for Theoretical Neuroscience, and the Mind, Brain, and Behavior Initiative at Harvard University. Dr. Kreiman's lab combines computational modeling, neurophysiological recordings, as well as psychophysical measurements to study perception and cognition. Dr. Kreiman, please.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you especially to all the organizers for bringing us here. It's a great honor to be speaking here, and also to see a lot of friends and to make new friends and to talk to all of you in person. So I'd like to tell you today about some of the work that we have been doing to try to understand episodic memory formation. We've been thinking about memory formation for many years, working with a lot of amazing colleagues, many of whom are shown here. Everything that I'm going to say, they deserve the credit for all the work. I won't be able to do justice to all the work of the people here. I just give you some of the snippets and some of the basic ideas, but here are all the heroes of the work that I will talk about today. So I'd like to start with just the notion that we can now store our entire lives in a hard drive. Perhaps a few decades ago, this was completely inconceivable, but this is not only it's not the realm of science fiction anymore. It's quite plausible. Let me just give you an order of magnitude calculation, and I'll start with a sense of vision. Of course, our lives are not just visual processing, but just to give you an order of magnitude of what we're talking about. So let's say that, roughly speaking, our eyes, there are about 1 million ganglion cells that project from the retina into cortex. So that, let's say that we have about 10 to the 6 pixels per second that we're transmitting in terms of visual processing. And let's say that we encode each pixel with 3 bytes of information. That is basically 1 byte per color at every pixel. And may we all live to 100 years old, and that's about 10 to the 9 or so seconds. So that if we calculate that, that's about 10 petabytes. So 10 petabytes is not a very scary number. As a matter of fact, many of you in your own labs may already be storing data which is on the order of 10 petabytes. So basically everything you'll ever see in your entire lives is on the order of a couple of petabytes. Of course, again, there's auditory information, and there's smell, and there's all of our internal ruminations and thinking and so on. But those probably are just a few numbers, maybe an order of magnitude more. But it's not inconceivable that we may be able to store our entire lives in hard drives in the near future. But that's not what our memories are really all about. So I'd like you to spend 10 seconds now to just think about what you did last Sunday. Close your eyes if you want, okay? And just try to remember, what happened last Sunday? What were you doing? Okay, so just So I'm sure you remember different things. Maybe you remember your friends, what you were eating. Maybe you watched a movie. Perhaps you went for a run. So whatever you were doing, your memories are very, very different from the kind of storage that I was referring to. So you don't remember pixel by pixel recollection of every single second. So there's something particularly magical and transformative about the way we store our memories, which allows us also to retrieve those memories in a very special way. And that's what I'd like to start thinking about and give you a few ideas of how we're thinking about that process. So basically, our memories are very different from this pixel level hard drive representation that I was alluding to. Our memories are stories. They are highly compressed. As a matter of fact, I will argue that most of our lives are forgotten. We forget most of the things that happen. I'm sure you did lots of exciting things on Sunday that you just don't remember. They are discrete. They're mostly discretized into concrete events, into very small chunks. Maybe you remember what you had for breakfast, and then you remember lunch and nothing in between. Or I don't know. You remember particularly concrete events and from our memories. And of course, our memories are also fallible. We tell our own narratives. We keep building our narratives. We could keep rebuilding and restructuring them. So this is what memories are all about, and that's the aspect of episodic memories that makes them so fascinating and so difficult to study. At the end of the day, memories are essentially who we are, and they are the very fabric of our own existence. So I'd like to further motivate the study of memory by relating two stories from two fictional stories that I think illustrate the differences between storing everything in a hard drive and our episodic memories. One of them is by a famous Argentinian fiction writer, Jorge Luis Borges, who talked about a particular fictitious character, Funes de Memorias. This is a character that suffers a head accident, a head injury after falling from a horse, and as a consequence of this accident, he purportedly had basically he never forgot anything anymore. Basically, he could remember absolutely everything. So at the beginning, it sounds very exciting to be able to remember absolutely everything, but very quickly, Borges goes on to describe how nefarious and how destructive it is for our daily lives to be able to remember every single second. For example, he's not able to distinguish the fact that one face at 1 p.m. is the same face at 1:01 p.m. Every single one of them seems to be completely different to him because of this infinite memory. And this topic is, for those of you who are Netflix aficionados, this topic is brought up again in one of the very dark episodes of a TV series called The Black Mirror. It's called The Entire History of You. And this describes the notion that we can store our entire lives and on all the consequence of, all the negative consequences of being able to remember every single second of our lives. So Borges concludes by saying that to think is to forget a difference, to generalize, to abstract. In the overly replete world of Funes, there were nothing but details. So what I'd like to understand is how can we forget differences? How can we learn to generalize, abstract, and form these episodic memories? So I'd like to tell you just a couple of glimpses of some of the work that we've been doing at the behavioral level to try to understand what constitutes an event and what it is that dictates those filters that make us remember some aspects of our lives and forget others. Then I'll talk a little bit about some of the computational, very initial first steps into computational models to try to make predictions about what we remember, and then go into the brain and give you some sense of what's happening into the brain when we are forming episodic memories. So in general, I'll talk about one proxy to study real-life memories, which is the use of movies. We've been doing work using movies, and one of the paradigms is illustrated here. We have subjects watch a TV series. Then there's some episode of time in between, which can go from 1 hour to months And then afterwards, we evaluate memory recall. And in particular, we used a TV series called 24, where all the events purportedly happen within the course of one day, and that will become evident in a second why this is relevant. And we discretized the events in the movie by using what's called a movie cut. That is a very sharp transition between one frame and the next. So basically, these are all the frames in a small segment of the movie, and you can see that every now and then, especially in the Hollywood style of filming, you have these very sharp transitions. For example, from frame 8011 to frame 8012, there's a major change from one frame to the next. Whereas then there's a continuous set of frames that's called a shot. Then there's another cut, and then a completely different frame comes in. And we use these shots as our basic units to probe memory formation. So the recall task, we will be showing individual frames or individual shots to subjects and asking whether they remember seeing that or not. And we will compare that with foils that are taken from the same TV series, but a different episode. So here I'm showing you a couple of frames from episode 1 of this TV series or episode 2 of the TV series. And we try to match them as much as possible in terms of the basic visual features, in terms of basic characters, and so on. So because everything happens supposedly within 24 hours, we can actually have pretty nice and pretty tight controls. People are wearing more or less the same clothes, it's the same environments, and so on. So as you can see, it can be pretty challenging to actually distinguish one frame from another, even though in one case people have seen one episode, but they have not seen the other. So let me give you a glimpse of the behavioral data. So what you're seeing here is one of the very several subjects that we tested at the behavioral level. On the x-axis, you have a segment of this TV episode from frame about 55,000 to 56,000 and so on. And the blue corresponds to events that were correctly remembered, and the red corresponds to events that were incorrectly remembered. So here's data from about 51 subjects for many different shots in the movie. And you can see just by glimpsing at this data that people tend to be quite consistent with each other. Not perfectly consistent, but whenever you see vertical bars, vertical lines of more or less the same color, that means that there are events that a lot of people remembered and events that a lot of people forgot about these movies. So in this way, we can compute the average memorability of every segment of the movie, and we can do this for the entire movie. So we can have lots of data on what specific aspects of the movie are to be remembered or forgotten. And we can do that for episode 1 and for episode 2. And then we can start to ask a series of basic behavioral questions to characterize memory formation for close to real life events. So I refer to these movies. Real movies are of course not real life, and I'll be happy to discuss that, and I'll show you some data on that. But they're sort of our primitive proxy for studying sort of semi-realistic memories. So the first point I want to make is perhaps pretty obvious. The ability to remember things depends on the duration of those shots. The longer they are, the better they are remembered. So the more frames you have in a shot, memory goes up. As you might expect, memory also decays with time. So if you have a lot of time in between when you actually see the episode and when you probe it, memory decays. This is true both for shots as well as for single frames. And here I had a lot of discussion with the grad student that was actually working on this. He was surprised that people were so bad at remembering things. For example, even a year after encoding, people were at about 60% in remembering single frames. I was surprised that they were so good in remembering anything. I have reached an age already where sometimes I'm watching a movie with my wife, and halfway through the movie we realize, oh, we've watched this movie before. So to me, it was remarkable that a year after, people can remember even a single frame above chance level. Not perhaps very impressive, they're at 60%, but still the fact that they can remember anything about the movie a year after, in particular a single frame, and they can distinguish that from a different one in the same episode, I thought it was remarkably good. My grad student thought I was remarkably bad, but I think, again, this is just a question of age. Okay, so just to summarize what I told you so far, memories are stories, they are compressed, they are discrete, they are fallible. We forget most of our lives. We study at the behavioral level episodic memory for movie events. We can show somewhat accurate revolve after a year post-posting coding. And in general, the results are quite consistent both within and across subjects. Okay, so movies are not real life. They are meant to entertain. The director is manipulating our attention. There's a compression of events. There are very specific viewing angles and sizes and so on. So just to hammer on this point, we did another experiment where we took actually people and had them walk around around Boston. There were two versions. One of them, they were walking around in the street. The other one, they were walking around in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And we basically did the same experiment, but instead of using movies, we used these videos of sort of recordings of real life events. So we had people with this contraption, basically a GoPro camera. We're filming everything they see, and then we can probe them. We know we have ground truth information about what they have seen, and then we can probe what they've done. So one of the experiments is, as I said, walking around in Boston. The other one is walking around in a pre-specified route in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Here are some of the details. I'm gonna skip some of the details in here, but the short story is that people's memories are way worse than what we showed with movies, as you might expect. So if I ask you very, very specific details, I ask you to walk 1 hour somewhere around Tel Aviv, and then I ask you, have you seen this particular car or this particular person, and so on. Basically, people are almost at chance. They're barely above chance in this kind of task. So depending on how you see this may be obvious to you, or this may be sad to you, but the fact is, most of our lives, most of our daily events, we just forget. We don't remember. The majority of our sensory experiences, we forget, and there's only a tiny fraction of them that we capture and we crystallize in the form of memories. So these results were more or less similar, regardless of whether we were walking in the street or in the museum. People did slightly better inside the museum. We spent a lot of time characterizing what aspects of information are better encoded, but in general, people have a very poor memory for the details of real life events. Okay, so next we wanted to ask what drives memorability. And so for that purpose, we combined a lot of laborious annotations of content by undergrads and a lot of computer vision. So we had computers look at the videos basically and annotate the heck out of the content. So we wanted to know who's there, doing what, to whom, and when. So we want to have absolute information about every single frame. So just to give you a sense of what that looks like for the case of the TV series, here I'm showing you the presence of each character, each person in the movie in every single frame. So for example, here there's one character in the movie that was called Wallace. So here on the x-axis you have all the frame in the movie. There are about 70,000 frames, and those colored bars there correspond to all the appearances of this person called Wallace within the movie. The color is not too relevant here. The color indicates whether it's a front view or a side view of this character and so on. So here we have every single person that was present in the movie. So there's Wallace, there's somebody called Palmer, etc., etc. So for every person, we have annotations about the presence of in every single frame. In a similar way, we have a lot of other annotations about emotional content, about the presence of cars, objects, about movement, and so on and so forth. And then we submit all of these content annotations to a very, very simple computational model using machine learning to ask, can we predict what people will remember based on these content annotations? Our goal is to try to build a predictive model of memory formation. And I'm going to skip all the details. So for the aficionados, this is basically standard machine learning. We have a vector that consists of all the features that we annotate in those shots. And we use a support vector machine with a linear kernel to try to make these predictions. So here's what we have. So we have a computational model, and for every subject, we try to ask how well can we predict what people will remember or not. So on the y-axis, we have classification accuracy. These are all the 40 different subjects for whom we collected behavioral data. And the short story is that we get about 70% correct on average in predicting the memorability of specific events. So we're very far from 100%. We can also, as a way of comparison, we can use the other subjects model. We can take subject 1 and ask whether the data from subject 1, how well can it predict subject 2. I told you that people are quite consistent, so we can predict memories in one subject from data from another subject quite well, but certainly not at 100%. So with that other subject model, we get close to 90% in predictability. So our ceiling is probably close to 90%, but not quite 100%. But just based on these very simple content annotations from manual annotations plus computer vision, we get a model that gives us about 70% correct in predicting what people will or will not remember from the movies. Okay, so this is what I wanted to say about our ability to make predictions about what will be memorable or not based on content annotations. And the last part of what I want to say today is to get inside the brain and our very, very preliminary and initial attempts to try to get at what are the mechanisms that dictate the formation of episodic memories. And for that, I will talk about the hippocampus. As many of you know, the hippocampus is a structure that plays a fundamental role in episodic memory formation. If you remember anything about any of the talks today, if you remember anything about them tomorrow, it will be thanks to the activity of the hippocampus. And it is perhaps here where a lot of our work intersects the most with the work of Professor Fani Adelman, because I'm going to talk a little bit about work that we've done in collaboration with Itzhak Fried and with others to try to look at the brains of patients with pharmacologically intractable epilepsy. And she has done a lot of work contributing to understanding the neuropsychology of patients with epilepsy, in evaluating those patients, and also to the fundamental role of the hippocampus in memory formation as well. So these are patients who cannot be treated pharmacologically, and I know several of you are very familiar with this line of questioning. These patients stay in the hospital for about 1 week after neurosurgeons implant electrodes in order to localize where the seizures are coming from. And I think we'll have a full discussion of this later in the afternoon with Itzhak Fried discussing this in further detail. So these patients stay in the hospital with electrodes that allow us to capture the activity of, in this case, I'm going to talk about single neuron recordings from high impedance microwires. These are the microwires that were developed by Professor Itzhak Fried. High impedance microwires here, we can sometimes get to the activity of individual neurons. And I'll ask what happens with the activity of individual neurons during the formation of episodic memories. And so this is just a quick sample of the brain on movies. This is a sample of data collected by Itzhak Fried's group. These are 7 subjects, about 300 or so different neurons in different brain areas. There's data from the amygdala, the entorhinal cortex, the hippocampus, and so on. And the x-axis here represents the entire episode of the same movie, this 42 minutes of movie. The color here indicates the activation. So we have all of these amazing and extremely rich data of what happens in the brain during movies. And then we can try to correlate the activity of individual movies with those measures of memorability, with the average memorability that I showed you before dictates which particular parts of the movie are more memorable or not. So here's an example of one particular neuron. This one is a neuron that's located in the parahippocampal gyrus that shows a weak but quite significant correlation with memorability. So what you're seeing here is over the course of 40 minutes or so of this episode, in red, the firing rate of this neuron. That is how the neuron changes its activation on a millisecond by millisecond basis. And this is being compared with the average memorability that we measure at the psychophysics level from our 41 subjects. And so here, in this case, there's a correlation of 0.3, which is certainly quite below 1, and quite way below the sort of models that I alluded to in terms of between-subject comparison, but well above 0. So there's a single neuron here that gives a glimpse of what people will remember or not. So we can take all of these neurons and again use the same type of machine learning approach that I alluded to before to actually decode what people will or will not remember. So here what you're seeing is decoding performance in the blue curve from all the spikes that we have from a given population size. So we cumulatively add more and more neurons to the population size and ask how well can we predict memory formation. And what's remarkable here again is that we can get somewhere around 70–75% performance in terms of decoding what people will or will not remember by taking the activity of a relatively small but remarkable set of neurons from the human brain. So the last point that I wanted, so just to summarize this part, there are individual neurons that show a weak but significant correlation with memorability, and by putting together many of these neurons, we can use machine learning to decode which aspects of the neuron of the movie will be remembered or not. So the last part that I want to talk about is this very remarkable aspect of our episodic memories, which has to do with the discrete nature of memories, the fact that we store memories in the form of events. And this work was inspired by observing one of my favorite neurons in a decade, which is shown here. So what you're seeing here is the activity of a single neuron, also in the parahippocampal gyrus. And these are what's called post-stimulus histograms, which are aligned to the onset of every single character in the movie. So each one of these plots corresponds to one character. So for example, on the upper left, we have a particular person called Jack Bauer, which is the main protagonist of this TV series. Here on the bottom left, we have somebody called Buchanan. That's another person in the movie, etc. So these are different characters in the movie. And time zero is when that person appeared on the movie. The raster plots, each dot corresponds to a spike, and then the histograms on the bottom correspond to the average activity. And what you can see is that there is very strong activation of this neuron, basically in every single instance right after time zero. That is, when you have those cuts, that is when there's a major shift from one frame to the next, there's a major transition in the activation of this neuron. This is extremely fast, extremely reliable from trial to trial. There is some differentiation from one character to another, but it's extremely remarkable that this neuron seems to be sort of responding to these cuts in the movies. So we're very interested in this notion that there may be neurons that are responsible for segmenting our continuous experience and detecting these events that happen during our continuous experience. So for that, we did another experiment where we were specifically trying to address this question of what dictates the difference between one event and the next. And so the experiment goes like this. We had, again, in this case, we had short video clips of about 8-second duration. And then again, we probed the memory. We asked people whether they remember or not specific aspects of those videos. And importantly, here we constructed these 8-second video clips to study 3 different types of potential boundaries. So some of the video clips contained no boundaries. So they were continuous 8 seconds where each frame was similar to the previous frame, and there was no cut. We also had what we called soft boundaries. That is cases where there is a major transition from one frame to the next, but the transition is continuous in terms of the overall narrative. So this is a transition that happens within the same movie. So for example, here you can see that it's some of the same people in the same environment, but there's still a major cut from one frame to the next. So we refer to that as a soft boundary. And then we have what we refer to as hard boundaries. That is completely unrelated events that go from one place, that go from one movie to a completely different movie. So basically, you watch 4 seconds of one movie and 4 seconds of a completely different movie. So that's a hard boundary. We refer to this as a cognitive event. And then we use the same scene recognition testing that I mentioned before. We show a frame. We ask people whether they remember that or not. And then we also have a time discrimination task where we have 2 frames, and we ask people which of those 2 frames happened before. So in that way, we probe whether they remember the order of different events. Okay, so let me, I think in the interest of time, I'm going to go very quickly through the behavioral conclusions. events that happen near a boundary are easier to remember. So we can measure how well people remember things that happen right after the boundary or very far away from the boundary. And we see that there is a correlation, so that things that happen right after these transitions are easier to remember. Than this happens both for soft boundaries as well as for hard boundaries, but not when, of course, when there is in the absence of any boundary. The other observation at the behavioral level is that hard boundaries disrupt the recollection of temporal order. So whenever you have these discontinuities in the narrative, then subjects fail to remember the order of the temporal order of different events. So I want to show some of the remarkable neurons that we found in the brain in response to these different types of boundaries. So what you're seeing here is a raster plot of the activity of a neuron in the hippocampus in response to 75 different video clips aligned to time 0, which is the presence of this soft boundary. And here we have the same raster plot, the same neuron in response to hard boundaries, and the same neuron in response to the no boundary events. So as you can see, there's a sharp activation of the neuron in response to these boundary events, both for the soft boundaries as well as for the hard boundaries. So we refer to these as boundary cells. Here's another example. Perhaps one of the most remarkable things that we found here in this study is the presence of some neurons that responded uniquely to the hard boundaries, but not to the soft boundaries. So here's a neuron that responded right after these very strong discontinuities in the narrative, but not to cases when there is a cut in the movie, but it's not accompanied by a change in the narrative. So to refer to this as a cognitive boundary, as a case where the narrative is changing, and this is not just a pure change in the visual sensory inputs that's also present in the soft boundaries. Okay, so that's all I wanted to say about the neurophysiology. So we found boundary cells that respond after any kind of transition, basically, but we also found these, what we refer to as event cells, which are cells that respond explicitly after these hard boundaries. So I just want to close by coming back to this idea that, yes, we can store our entire lives in our hard drives. I suspect that many of our children or grandchildren will indeed have a hard drive saying, this is my entire life. What we really need is more research in computer science and AI to be able to extract that information, retrieve that information in a useful way, and especially to connect this to the devastating conditions that affect our memories, including senile dementia and Alzheimer's and many others, to be able to understand what we can do to be able to restore the capacity to form memories and learning in those cases where these cognitive abilities are failing. So again, I didn't have time to do justice to all of these people. Many of these people shown here contributed to this work, and I want to thank again the organizers for bringing me here.
Thank you, Professor Kreiman, for this great talk. Professor Cochin.
I think that our system, memory system, has developed genetically not to remember these points that you have looked at in the study, but rather the general view. So the problem with Kuhn's and Memorias is that he could not forget these details. So the important thing is to forget these details that, and to remember the things which we call important. So how does this result of yours are relevant to the real problem?
I cannot agree more. I think that, so just to repeat the question is, what's the ecological relevance? Ultimately, what we really want to understand is memories in the real world, our memories, what we remember. So again, a lot of the work in the memory field has been based on presenting individual words or individual pictures. So we're trying to move towards real life memory formation. We're not, I agree with you, we're not quite there yet. I would contend that movies and what we're studying is a good step in the right direction. But ultimately, I agree. I think we need to understand understand what happens in the real world when we are, just living our lives and the formation of those memories. It's much harder to control those experiments, and like most scientists, we're obsessed with controlling things and measuring things. But I agree. I think that we need to move much closer to real-world memory events.
I have a question. Professor Kreiman, do you think that this kind of ability to trim memories?
You can answer the phone. That's fine.
Yeah, no, this time for next speak. This ability to trim, let's call it the memories, is like defected in some psychiatric disorders like PTSD or something. Could you please elaborate on that?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And as you know better than I do, that there are devastating memory deficits. You mentioned PTSD. There's, of course, Alzheimer's disease. There are many conditions that affect the memory system. All of these conditions have a pretty devastating effect on the quality of life. We suspect that many of these do have to do with the kind of medial temporal lobe systems that we're studying, and there are several people, including many who are here, who have begun to take some initial steps towards building systems that might help one day ameliorate those problems. But this is an urgent topic for the field to work on.